They didn't expect him to see it. They didn't expect him to act so quickly. But in the darkness over Burkina Faso, a storm was brewing. A storm that would send shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington and Paris. Under the quiet African sky, a game-changing moment unfolded. Western drones, once thought to be untouchable, were brought down in an instant. The world had underestimated this young nation, and on that night, Ibrahim Traoré, the man at the center of it all, sent a message. A message that rang louder than any bomb, louder than any military strike. It was a message of defiance, a message that echoed through the skies and rattled the very foundations of global power. This wasn't just a military operation, it was a declaration of sovereignty, a declaration that the skies over Africa and the future of its people belonged to no one but them. If this moment has sparked your curiosity, then subscribe to our channel and stay with us as we unravel how one man's bold action shook the world. Don't miss out on the rest of the story. The skies above Burkina Faso had always been quiet, peaceful until that night. What started as whispers in the northern farmlands soon turned into reports that could no longer be ignored. Farmers in the desert regions spoke of an eerie hum, something foreign, something unnatural. A low pulsing sound that hovered, only to vanish into the vast Sahel winds. Herders, too, men who had spent their lives beneath the vast African sky, began to notice strange shadows darting across the moonlit heavens. Shadows without wings, silent, elusive, unnatural. At first, these tales were dismissed as superstition, but the stories kept coming. Local military patrols in the Sahel corridor began reporting faint, blinking lights in the night. Lights that moved in patterns no bird or plane could match. These weren't random. These were deliberate. Something or someone was watching them. Watching Burkina Faso. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not the type to dismiss such reports as the work of wild imaginations. He knew better. In a world dominated by foreign powers, nothing happens by accident. Behind every shadow, there's a hand pulling the strings. Behind every quiet hum in the sky, there's a force trying to peer where it doesn't belong. Traoré, ever the strategist, understood this game well. This was not just a matter of airspace violations, it was an infringement on their sovereignty, an act of dominance masked as security. Traoré immediately ordered a full-scale technical sweep of the airspace. His military team, though lacking the resources of Western powers, was determined. Using radar and infrared detection, they began scanning frequencies, tracking aerial patterns, and mapping every unusual movement in the sky. What they found sent a chill through the entire Burkinabe High Command. These weren't just random incidents. These were coordinated operations. The drones didn't fly haphazardly. They followed specific routes, sticking to the same patterns night after night. Their encrypted communications and altitude readings indicated something far more sophisticated than mere observation. These were military-grade surveillance drones. Western drones. The kind of technology that normally stayed far above the reach of nations like Burkina Faso. But now, these machines silent, invisible to the naked eye, were intruding upon the skies that belonged to the people of Burkina Faso. The realization hit like a hammer. It wasn't just the airspace that was being violated. It was the country's very right to remain unseen, to remain sovereign. The drones weren't observing forests or empty deserts. No. They were focusing on specific military zones, key defense corridors in the north, the newly fortified perimeter near the Sahel border, and most telling of all, the mineral-rich zones where Burkina Faso had recently taken a bold step to revoke foreign mining concessions. This wasn't just surveillance. It was a calculated move and economic maneuver, cloaked under the guise of national security. Burkina Faso's resources, its land, its people, they were all being watched, mapped, and prepared for a future no one had asked for. This was no longer about airspace. It was about a deeper violation. Traoré knew this well. Western powers had been quietly monitoring Africa's movements for decades, watching their resources, studying their strategies, all while speaking of partnerships and cooperation. The truth was much darker. The West, in its quiet superiority, had come to believe that Africa's destiny was theirs to dictate from afar. But not anymore. The night the drones flew in once again, the Burkinabe radar operators were ready. Every detection system was calibrated. Every piece of equipment, from the most basic radar to the most advanced anti-aircraft systems, was in place. Traoré's command center was alive with activity, but there was no panic, only calm, cold determination. Traoré, ever the man of action, did not delegate this task to anyone else. He took charge, personally overseeing every move. The quiet confidence in his demeanor was infectious, setting the tone for everyone around him. And then, in the dead of night, the drones appeared. 3 of them, flying in tight formation, heading straight for a key military zone in the north. It was their regular route, nothing new, nothing unexpected. But this time, it would be different. Traoré had one goal: to show them that Burkina Faso was no longer invisible. They had watched for too long, and now it was time for the watchers to be watched. The clock struck midnight. The first radar blip appeared, then another, and another. The drones were on their way. With no time to waste, the Burkinabe air defense system locked in on them. The drones, designed to evade conventional detection systems, attempted to juke, weaving through the night. But they underestimated Burkina Faso's newfound capabilities. Traoré's team had been working tirelessly to adapt and fine-tune their systems. Now it was their turn to strike. The order was simple: neutralize them. And with that, the first missile streaked across the desert sky. The explosion lit up the night. The first drone vanished in a flash of light. But would the others follow? Could Burkina Faso's military handle the full force of these foreign intruders? The clock was ticking, and the world was about to witness something extraordinary. The first missile cut through the night like a ghostly scream, the flash of its explosion lighting up the desert sky. The first drone was gone in an instant, its metal shell disintegrating above the Sahel like a falling star. The Burkinabe team barely had time to breathe before the second drone, caught in the same radar grip, was struck down with surgical precision. Seconds later, the third drone, in a final desperate attempt to escape, tried to jam the signals, attempting to veer off course. But it was no use. Burkina Faso's air defense system had anticipated every move. The second missile streaked into the sky, tearing through the silence. The drone attempted a series of evasive maneuvers, but it had already lost the fight. The third and final strike obliterated the last intruder, leaving nothing but a trail of smoke in the dark. In less than 6 minutes, every single foreign drone that had entered Burkina Faso's airspace that night was gone. The skies were quiet once more, but the silence was deafening. Back in the command center, Traoré stood still, his eyes fixed on the monitors. There was no celebration, no cheers, just an eerie calm that followed the adrenaline-fueled chaos. He had led his team through the operation with precision, and now the job was done. But as the last drone fell, a sense of realization began to sink in. This was no ordinary mission. The world was about to wake up to something it hadn't expected. Across the globe, the news began to spread like wildfire. Washington, Paris, London, the capitals of the West, were in disarray. Intelligence agencies scrambled to understand how a small, resource-limited African country had pulled off such a remarkable feat. How had Burkina Faso, of the most overlooked nations in the world, taken down advanced Western surveillance drones with such military precision? Was it a fluke, a malfunction, or something more troubling? The Pentagon convened a special meeting. Within hours, the report was on Donald Trump's desk. Sources close to the former U.S. president described him as deeply alarmed by the intelligence briefing. This wasn't just about losing 3 drones. It was about the efficiency of the operation, the way Burkina Faso's military had executed the strike with almost surgical accuracy. The implications were far-reaching. For years, the West had enjoyed the freedom to monitor African nations, their skies, their resources, without so much as a whisper of resistance. The idea that a small, impoverished nation could not only detect their advanced drones, but neutralize them with such speed and efficiency was something they hadn't accounted for. How had this happened? The questions mounted, but there were no easy answers. In the halls of power, behind closed doors, the panic set in. Intelligence officers, diplomats, and military officials from the West were left scratching their heads. How had they been so blind? How had their drones been detected? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, who else was watching? The truth was, no one knew. No one could fathom how an African nation, long overlooked and underestimated, had managed to punch so far above its weight. Burkina Faso had not just responded to a foreign threat. They had delivered a resounding message that would reverberate across the globe. But the world outside remained eerily quiet. No press conferences, no public statements, no acknowledgement of what had just occurred. The silence was profound, almost as if the global powers were hoping that this event would fade away unnoticed. But for those who understood the significance of what had transpired, the silence spoke louder than any declaration could. In Burkina Faso, the people were beginning to hear the whispers. The story spread through the streets, passed from mouth to mouth, from market to market. They had done it. The drones, the silent watchers of the night, had been destroyed. And for the first time in a long while, the people of Burkina Faso felt something they had long been denied: pride. For once, their skies were their own. They weren't being watched. They were being defended. But the world was far from finished with Burkina Faso. In Washington, the silence was only temporary. Behind the scenes, discussions were happening. The West had to recalibrate its strategies, and those conversations would soon spill over into the corridors of power. What would Burkina Faso's next move be? Would they face retaliation? Or had they just ignited a fire that would burn brighter across Africa? The dust had barely settled when the first tremors of consequence began to ripple through the international community. The Western powers, stunned by the precision and speed of the Burkinabe response, scrambled to understand how such an operation was possible. Intelligence agencies rushed to analyze every detail, every piece of data, anything that could explain how a nation with limited military resources had successfully taken down Western drones. What had just occurred wasn't a mere accident. It was a carefully executed strike that challenged the very foundation of foreign dominance in African skies. In Washington, the mood was tense. The U.S. government was caught off guard, not just by the loss of their drones, but by the boldness of Burkina Faso's counter-operation. There were hushed meetings, back-channel discussions, and urgent calls to strategize. How had they missed the signs? More alarmingly, how many other African nations were capable of pulling off such an operation? The fear wasn't just about losing drones. It was about losing control over a region that had been quietly monitored for decades. The destruction of the drones wasn't just a military victory for Burkina Faso, it was a profound symbol. For years, African nations had been subjected to the gaze of foreign powers. Satellites, planes, drones they watched over the continent, tracking resources, studying military movements, and shaping the destinies of African nations from afar. But on that night, Burkina Faso had turned the tables. The message was clear. Africa's sky is not your playground. This wasn't just about military action. It was about reclaiming control. It was about saying no to the quiet dominance of the West, the people of Burkina Faso. Many of whom had long been ignored by the international community, now found themselves at the heart of a global story. In the capital city of Ouagadougou, there was a palpable shift in mood. People walked the streets with a sense of pride that had long been absent. The sovereignty of their nation had been defended, not by a foreign power, but by their own people. The operation had been swift, decisive, and undeniable. It was a message that the world could no longer ignore. Burkina Faso was a nation to be reckoned with. But the story didn't end there. The consequences of this operation were felt far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. The incident reverberated across the continent, inspiring a sense of pride in other African nations that had long been subject to foreign interference. It became a rallying cry for sovereignty. In every corner of Africa, young people, activists, and political leaders began to see that change was not only possible, it was happening. The symbolism was powerful. For decades, African nations had been treated like passive actors in global politics. The West had conducted its operations with the assumption that African nations would remain silent, obedient, and compliant. But Ibrahim Traoré's operation shattered that illusion. It wasn't just about the destruction of drones, it was about proving that Africa could stand on its own 2 feet, defend its territory, and assert its right to self-determination. The immediate aftermath of the operation saw an increase in the country's national pride and unity. Soldiers who once stood guard under the watchful eyes of foreign drones now stood taller. Farmers, who had once lived in fear of the invisible machines that hummed overhead, now slept peacefully under the African sky. The psychological impact was just as powerful as the military one. The people of Burkina Faso knew, without a doubt, that their land, their sky, and their sovereignty were being defended not by foreign powers, but by their own. But with victory came a new set of challenges. Burkina Faso had proven that it could defend itself, but the global powers were not likely to let this slip by unnoticed. As the weeks passed, international chatter grew louder. The Western world, while officially silent, began recalibrating its approach to Africa. The implications of what had transpired in the skies over Burkina Faso were far-reaching. African nations that had long been under the radar of foreign surveillance were beginning to rethink their place in the world. What does this mean for the future of African sovereignty? Will other nations follow Burkina Faso's lead? And how will the West react in the long term? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this conversation. The world was waking up to a reality it had long ignored. African nations were no longer passive players in the geopolitical game. The night Ibrahim Traoré's military neutralized the Western drones marked a seismic shift, but the reverberations were felt most strongly in Washington and other Western capitals. Behind closed doors, the realization began to sink in. Burkina Faso had just done something that no one had expected, and it had done so with breathtaking efficiency. In the United States, the fallout from the operation was immediate and intense. At the Pentagon, discussions were urgent, secretive, and far from the calm diplomacy the U.S. typically displayed. The loss of drones wasn't the only shock. The real concern was how a small African nation had pulled off such a sophisticated operation. The question on everyone's mind was, how did they know? How did Burkina Faso's military manage to adapt so quickly, detect the drones, and neutralize them without any warning? And how had they managed to do it without the support of Western allies? U.S. intelligence agencies scrambled to assess the full scope of the situation. At the heart of the panic was the fear of vulnerability. For years, Western powers had operated with the belief that their surveillance technologies, drones, satellites, reconnaissance planes, could peer into Africa's most private spaces with impunity. But now, a small nation had shown them that their power was not absolute, that even the most advanced military technology could be thwarted by a nation that refused to be intimidated. The loss of these drones, while significant, was not nearly as alarming as the realization that other African nations might soon follow suit. It was a wake-up call that Africa's skies were no longer theirs to control. Across the Atlantic, in Paris and London, the reaction was similarly strained. French diplomats, deeply invested in their former colonies, were left grappling with how this would affect their relationships in the region. France, in particular, had long maintained a close relationship with the military and economic structures of several West African nations. But this event underscored a growing independence in Africa that Western powers hadn't accounted for. If Burkina Faso, with its relatively modest resources, could take down Western drones with precision, what did that mean for the future of French influence in the Sahel? While official statements were hard to come by, European diplomats acknowledged the growing sentiment of defiance across Africa. The operation in Burkina Faso wasn't just about a single military victory. It was part of a broader, continent-wide awakening. African nations, long subjected to surveillance, extraction, and manipulation by foreign powers, were beginning to chart their own paths. And then, there was the broader global reaction. While no government officially took responsibility for the drones silent as they were on the matter, international experts began analyzing the event from every angle. Some dismissed it as an anomaly, attributing it to technical malfunction or a freak accident. But others, those with a clearer understanding of Africa's political shifts, knew better. This was not a malfunction. It was a deliberate statement. A small, underestimated country had just shown the world that Africa's sovereignty was not up for negotiation. The consequences were only beginning to unfold. What had seemed like an isolated event was now signaling the end of an era. The West, for the first time in decades, was forced to reconsider its approach to Africa. No longer could it be assumed that African nations would silently accept foreign surveillance. No longer could they be overlooked and dismissed as powerless. As the global powers recalibrated, one question remained. How would the West respond to this new wave of African defiance? Would this be the beginning of a larger movement, or would the status quo resume? The world was watching, and the next steps would decide the future of African sovereignty on the world stage. In the wake of the operation, Ibrahim Traoré's calm resolve remained unchanged. He didn't stand in front of the press, boasting about his victory. There were no grand speeches, no self-congratulations. Instead, Traoré took quiet but decisive action to ensure that his nation remained prepared for whatever the future held. The operation to take down the drones had proven that Burkina Faso's airspace was worth defending, but it was only the beginning of a new chapter for the country and for Africa as a whole. One of Traoré's first moves was to reinforce the country's air defense systems, ensuring that the nation's ability to detect and neutralize foreign surveillance technology was more sophisticated than ever. He knew that this victory was symbolic, but the real battle for sovereignty would be fought in the long term. Strengthening Burkina Faso's military and technological capabilities would be key to ensuring that this wasn't a one-off success, but part of a broader shift in African geopolitics. Traoré also placed a heavy emphasis on training young engineers and military technicians, many of whom were locally trained. For too long, Africa had relied on foreign expertise in areas such as military technology and defense systems. But Traoré was determined to ensure that his people were not just recipients of foreign aid or technology, they would create their own solutions. This initiative became a cornerstone of his leadership, empowering the youth, building a self-reliant defense system, and making sure that the next generation of African leaders had the skills to protect their nations without relying on external powers. The psychological impact within Burkina Faso was just as significant as the military success. For the first time in decades, the Burkinabe people felt like they were truly in control of their own destiny. Soldiers who had once stood at attention beneath the hum of foreign drones now stood tall, knowing that their nation was ready to defend itself. Farmers who once feared the sight of a strange drone above their fields now went to bed under the calm, uninterrupted African sky. The operation had instilled a sense of pride and confidence in a nation that had long been overlooked by the world. But this shift in mindset was not isolated to Burkina Faso. The ripples of this operation spread throughout the continent. Young people across Africa began to take notice. If Burkina Faso could stand up to the world's most powerful nations, why couldn't they? Across the Sahel, in Central Africa and beyond, the message was clear. Africa could defend itself, and its sovereignty was not up for negotiation. But Traoré knew that this moment couldn't be the end. He strengthened Burkina Faso's alliances with nations that respected sovereignty, ones that had always supported Africa's right to determine its own future. These relationships would be crucial in the coming years, as more African nations began to follow Burkina Faso's example. For the first time, there was hope for a continent that had long been divided by colonial borders, external manipulation, and economic exploitation. While the international community debated and recalibrated, the people of Burkina Faso moved forward with quiet determination. Ibrahim Traoré had shown them that the impossible could be achieved with unity, ingenuity, and a deep belief in their sovereignty. The next chapter of African history was just beginning, and the world would no longer be able to ignore it. As the rest of the world tried to comprehend the implications of what had transpired, one thing was certain: the global balance of power had shifted. Africa was no longer a continent to be watched. It was a continent that was now watching back. What would the future hold for nations like Burkina Faso? And how would the West respond to this new wave of defiance? The next few years would be critical in determining the future of African sovereignty. The destruction of 3 drones wasn't just a military operation, it was a declaration. A declaration that the skies above Africa belong to Africa. The Ibrahim Traoré moment marked a turning point, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. For decades, African nations have been subjected to foreign dominance, watched, monitored, and manipulated from the skies by foreign powers. But in one night, that narrative began to shift. The message was loud and clear. Africa is no longer an observer in its own affairs. It is a player. This moment wasn't just about military strength. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and pride. Ibrahim Traoré, through calculated action, showed that even the smallest nations have the power to defend their skies and protect their future. The operation was not a victory born from a desire to provoke, it was born from necessity. A necessity to defend Burkina Faso's sovereignty in an age where the line between diplomacy and surveillance had blurred beyond recognition. The ripple effect of this operation was felt far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In every corner of Africa, the question was no longer, how do we protect our resources? But, how do we protect our sovereignty? Traoré's message wasn't just a military one. It was a psychological shift. For the first time, Africa had seen that it didn't have to be a passive participant in global affairs. It could act. It could defend. It could stand tall. But while the world may not have fully processed the significance of this event, it will. The West may have tried to brush it off, but behind the silence, the recalibration is already happening. Countries are beginning to look at Africa in a different light. The narrative is no longer about Africa needing help, it's about Africa rising to meet its own challenges. As we reflect on this, we must ask ourselves, what does the Ibrahim Traoré reaction mean for the future of Africa? Will other nations follow in his footsteps? Will we see a new era where Africa no longer just reacts, but leads? This is just the beginning of a new African renaissance. What do you think the world should expect next? Will Africa's rise continue, or will the West find new ways to hold its power? Comment below and share your thoughts on the future of African sovereignty. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on the unfolding changes in global politics.